Welcome to Earth, a Love Story. I'm your host, Robin Lassiter. This time on the podcast, I welcome the one and only Darren King, aka ExoAcademian. Darren hosts two excellent podcasts that you should definitely check out. The Point of Convergence Podcast addresses interrelated topics such as the UFO phenomenon, alien abductions, ongoing contact experiences, remote viewing, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, interdimensionality, and high strangeness. In addition to discussing these and related topics, he explores their apparent connection as contact modalities within the bedrock of entangled consciousness. Darren also co-hosts the Liminal Phrames podcast, which is dedicated to the exploration of the meaning-making models we form around UFOs, contact with NHI, and paranormal experience. And as you know, I love meaning-making models. Darren shares with us many of his personal anomalous experiences, as well as how he's welcomed in his emotional body, which, as you know, is also my jam. We also talk about a subject that I've been sitting with for a while now, that of influence, nefarious or not, what it looks like, what are the results, and what to do about it. I'm going to talk a lot more about that subject in the months to come, but it was great to touch on it here with Darren. It was a total pleasure to have this conversation, and I hope that you enjoy. You, on your podcast, give so much structure, framework, theory, history, trying to inform people that this isn't just kind of a nuts and bolts, like lights in the sky kind of thing. And when I started the podcast, I was like, I'm not that person. I'm not going to be doing that. I'm very interested in human stories. And I'm curious about your evolution through like how you got here and to this subject and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm wide open to talking about that. And it's interesting how that story slightly gets recontextualized as time goes on. I often talk about that. Like things happen that help me understand things in the past a bit more. But yeah, I'm happy to go wherever you want to go.
Cool. That's wonderful. Way. Thank you. Yeah. I also have to say that I listen to your podcast in kind of when I have capacity for it, because almost every time I listen to it, it like shifts my ontology a little bit. And as we know, that is not always a comfortable thing to happen.
Right,
it depends on like how resourced I am. But I have very strong memories of listening to your podcast, like while building this dome. And specifically, I think it was talking about hybrids or the collection of genetic material, something like that, which I had synchronistically or whatever, just had a big experience with. And so hearing it reflected by like a third party, I remember sitting down and having just to let the waves go through me. So I think you have a very powerful podcast, but it's a lot.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. It's like, whew, you feel like you're always on the edge, which is great, which is really great.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Thank you. And I mean, for me, getting into the consciousness piece, getting into all aspects of what have happened, both pleasant and unpleasant, I think is really important. Yeah, so I try to cover all of it, but I think it's bizarre how experiencer stories aren't covered more than they are, just because they're so central to the whole thing. And people go around acting like we don't know what these beings are or what they want or what they say. And yes, we do. We just, you have to take the body of literature from experiencers seriously. So yeah, that's kind of what I try to do. And then combination of that and having some of my own experiences, I think once someone's had some of those experiences, it completely makes them open up to this breadth of experience that people are having. Yeah, so I'm happy to try to bridge those two worlds. And then nuts and bolts stuff is just not that interesting to me. It's the least interesting part for sure.
Yeah, same. Yeah, that was my experience as well. Hearing Stuart Davis and Sean Esbjorn Horgens talk about, and I think Sean said something like, what if we just believe people? And then it like broke a dam inside of my psyche where I had been compartmentalizing all these things and realizing like, I believe, I'm going to start to believe myself, my own experiences.
Right.
And so when I fully integrate, as fully as I have been able to integrate in my experiences and believed
Yeah.
my own lived experience, then my capacity to believe other people was wide open. So I understand that. It's like until there's space and ability to let that reality in, either through personal, I mean, I think maybe only through personal experience, it seems to be
Yeah.
just kind of kept at a distance. So yeah, that makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense to
there's
me.
actually really interesting cases with John Mack where in the 90s he would be interviewing a new person who was coming to talk about experiences. And at that point, that person might have been trying to keep it as a dreamlike state, like they hadn't
Mm,
fully, decided what it was, and partly for their own psychological health, wanted to allow that to be potentially be a dream. And then they would be describing some sort of crap they saw, and then John would pull out an illustration
mm,
and say, "Did it look like this?" And they're like, well, "Yeah, but how did you know that? Like, I didn't mention that yet." And he was like, "Well, this is actually one of the other experiencers."
mm.
And then it kind of hits them like there are other people having these experiences. This is not just in my head. And then it takes on a whole different kind of gravity. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That like third party confirmation it's kind of an experience in itself where things shift
Yeah.
and move. Yeah. I wonder, were you ever interested in the nuts and bolts stuff? And I guess that question is inviting you to talk about like how you got started in this and where it began
Yeah. I
and
mean, I'm
where.
happy to go into that. I mean, I think my earliest, you know, interest was actually in the Whitley Strieber book. So pretty much right from the beginning, I was more interested in the encounters with the beings than I was with the technology per se. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I
And
do
when
pay
was
attention to it, and I do try to use it as one of the distinguishing factors for like trying to separate out patterns in the data. Like one of the things I'm really trying to pay attention to in this really complex topic is sort out different sort of enterprises from different kinds of beings because and I've talked to Sean about this, like, because we do work together with the John Mack Institute, and we tend to conflate and collapse all this stuff together, and which just makes it more confused, I think. So yeah, so I do pay attention, and there seems to be a range of like how advanced the technology is, like starting from something that might be like 50 or 100 years ahead of us to something that might be, so organically seemingly based that it's kind of blends or blurs our notion of what technology is, and also even just in terms of the how much technology the black programs have been able to replicate, right? I also pay attention to that in order to try to figure out when is it black ops trying to parade as UFOs and aliens.
mm-hmm.
So I do pay attention, but because I want to try to understand the larger context usually.
Right. Yeah. And that makes sense. Yeah. And I mean, I've seen craft. It's part of my experience.
Right.
I am interested in it in that way. I'm very uninterested in being attached at all to like the narrative of disclosure. But of course, I pay
Mhm.
attention to it. Like it's part of the
Right.
unfolding of what's happening. I just am
Right.
not, um, I don't think that we can rely on any of that at all. That's my
Right.
perception. And also it's great that it's amazing that something is happening, that something is emerging, but
Right.
it's not the meat of it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and as I've been saying, I don't know how you get into the meat without completely throwing off our entire sense of history and what is real. And it's such a Pandora's box that I think we're always going to have a steep incline to sort of ever getting that out. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I would love to hear the journey, because I'm on my own journey and very recently what's most alive for me right now is an acceptance and understanding of how much um, humanity has been influenced, which is a very nuanced topic for me. I don't,
Right.
it's not like I am kind of allergic to knee-jerk conspiracy theory stuff or to saying that we're victims of something in some way, but just like acknowledging that there's been influence and really deeply
Right.
examining like that, how that's affected me. So for me, this is, a years long or a lifelong journey. So I'm curious about how it's been for you arriving at these places. Yeah, so you mentioned that you kind of started with the Whitley Strieber book. When was that in your life, and had you had experiences before that?
That was like in my late teens, early 20s. And at that point, I had not really had any experiences. It was after that I did.
Mm,
Although the way that I was drawn to his material was so strong that I sometimes wonder if there's something subconscious recognizing, like all my friends remember at the time, like, man, you're really like taken with this stuff, but it was later that I had experiences. I mean, there were a couple things when I was really young, but most of that actually came back like as fragments, like way later
Mm.
that I kind of remember these fragments of things that I can't really say I know what happened. So yeah, so it was sort of after his books that I had experiences. This sort of like also factors into the whole thing about synchronicity and how there being times where we feel like our lives feel a little bit like a script.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I also have this sense that like a higher version of ourselves is also to some extent guiding us, sending information, leaving breadcrumbs. So in that sense, it's a combination of things in terms of what I've been led by. Um, and I look back and I feel like in retrospect, I go, wow, I can really see how this makes sense now. So what looked like a meandering journey now feels like at this point you pick up this point you pick up this. So yeah, it's been fascinating to see that recontextualized over time for sure. It's totally changed things. Like the last few years for me have been totally insane in terms of how much has shifted. Um, it feels like everything has kind of been shifted. So, but it also feels not at all haphazard, feels very designed. I mean, I had to respond. There's a relational aspect to it, but it feels very much like a path laid in front of me. So it's been a trip for sure.
Yeah, yeah, I can I can relate to so much of that, partly, talking about having to recontextualize like what's real and all of our collective history, but also our personal history. For me, it
Right.
was sort of like a switch was flipped in 2019. And
Hmm.
I had had experiences my entire life, but suddenly it was all arranged into this narrative that
Right.
that connected everything. And yeah, and then it's been a wild journey since then. So it
Hmm.
sounds similar. Like I can really relate to that. Do you want
Right.
to go into what your experiences were after you read Whitley's work?
Yeah. So for me, I would say that while I read Whitley Strieber's books and was really impacted by the narrative and what he went through, really fascinated by the interaction with the beings, fascinated by this sort of blend between really eye-opening, paradigm stretching experiences, but also how challenging they were and how difficult they were, how frightening they were, like kind of ontological shock. For me, the first thing that happened that was really daunting and changed my paradigm and was so paradigm stretching that I didn't know where to put it was my wife at the time and I were moving our young family across the country from Tennessee to Washington State. And we had this experience where we were staying in a hotel, and this was in 2005. Our daughter was 3 years old at the time, and my wife was pregnant with our son. And I awoke in the early morning hours to see a female entity at the end of our bed. So we had our bed here, and then our daughter was in the bed next to us. And at first, your brain just goes, this must be our daughter who's woken up and is maybe disoriented about where she is. But that didn't really make any sense because pretty clearly I realized this being's too tall to be her. But your brain's just trying to, land it somewhere. And I got out of bed and started walking towards this female entity. And I remember distinctly the expression on her face was one of surprise, like surprise that I could see her maybe, or surprise that I woke up like I wasn't supposed to or something. I'm not really clear what that was, but it definitely looked like surprise. And then she started backing up towards the wall and proceeded to go right through the wall. And at that point, I did something that doesn't make any sense in retrospect until at least I came across some of the ufological material in terms of how often this happens in terms of behavior not really matching what you think you would do. So at that point, I just turned around to come back to bed.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, and this made such a huge difference. And I'm so grateful for this because this is so different than what many people experience when this is a solo journey, is that my wife at the time had woken up and seen the entire thing as well.
Mm.
So she sort of shook me when I got back into the bed to go to sleep and said, what are you doing going to sleep? Like, we know what we just saw. And that kind of snapped me out of some sort of hypnotic kind of thing or something. And we discussed it. decided to get out of there as quickly as we can. We weren't going to stick around. So it was probably like 4 a.m. or something at that point. Still partially dark outside. And so we got our daughter and got on the road. One thing that was interesting is that our daughter also had these welts all over her body. And we weren't sure what that was from. I mean, it could be something prosaic, like an allergic reaction to the sheets or something, or maybe there was some sort of bug in the sheets, but we'd never seen that before or after. And those welts completely cleared up after the fact. So that was interesting. And I remember getting to the next hotel. In those days, you kind of had like a big computer in the front room of the hotel where you could, in a lobby, and you could email people. So I would email people and family and friends and say, had this crazy experience. And they'd be like, wow, yeah, it's weird. Anyway, what's the weather like down there? Like they would quickly change the subject, and not know really what to do with it. And at the time, I didn't know, is this a ghost? Is this an apparition? I didn't think it had to do with the UFO phenomenon particularly. It wasn't until much later when I read so much of the lore and the data in terms of how many times humanoid and human looking beings are encountered. So that was something I sort of filed in the back of my head and didn't know what to do with it, basically. At that point, I had no place to put it. No one seemed to want to talk about it. So you just file it back there because what else can you do? And you sort of go on. And then also, I think when I look back in retrospect, so much of my experience with that former spouse of mine was really key in terms of exposing me to anomalous kinds of experiences, because even when she was young, her mother actually took her to see a medium because so many weird things would happen in their house, like things like kind of poltergeist kind of activity. So there's something about her that's definitely a conduit that seemed to, add to my experiences and also introduce me to things that had happened before. So and when she was young, like for instance, her parents even a couple times like burned dolls and things she had because they thought there was something up with them. So in addition to having that experience, I've also had experiences with her where we would be in a hotel actually in Denver and way up, multiple stories up in the air, and we'd be on a corner suite. So there'd be like no room behind us. And yet we would hear these rapping on like above the bed frame kind of thing. And there's like nothing but open air out there basically, which was really, really strange. I've had other experiences where there was one time we were, basically when I was in California, I used to host these like shamanic journeys for people. And so one time when we had first moved to Asheville, North Carolina, we were, the three of us. So my ex-wife, my son, and I were kind of doing this ritual where we were inviting positive benevolent entities and using this mother drum that I was using and just sort of sending out this positive intention. And then when we were done, I didn't think really much of it. And then we had an experience where we were downstairs and suddenly we heard this, what sounded like a huge rainstorm is kind of how I can describe it. It sounded really intense, really loud. And there was also a humming sound. So what's weird about this, again, in terms of behavior, is it's super anomalous. Like it came out of nowhere, sounded like the heaviest downpour and this humming sound. And we mentioned it to each other, the three of us, but nobody went to look. No one looked outside. No one went to check this out. And we just kind of went about our business, which is strange considering what we had just been doing too, in terms of this inviting kind of ceremony. And then eventually it stopped. And then soon after that, our teenage daughter came home and we said, "Oh, did you get caught in the rain?" And she's like, "What rain? It's not raining." Right. So there was no rain. It was completely dry outside, which was really, really strange. So the experience was strange. Our reaction was strange. And then the next day we were out walking and we ran into this couple that are our next door neighbors. And what's really interesting is the woman brought up and said, "Did you hear that thing last night?" And we're like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Well, what did you think?" And we're like, "Well, what did you think?" And she said, "I immediately thought UFO." And then her husband said, "What? What happened?" And then she described what happened. But what was weird is they were upstairs in their bedroom. She experienced the whole thing, heard the whole thing. He didn't hear a thing. And she also didn't mention it to him. It wasn't until she ran into us that it got brought up. So again, this raises really interesting questions around, how is this impacting us? Is this happening in physical reality? Is it impacting certain consciousnesses and not others? so much of my research has shown how common that is, where you can have these like custom crafted events where three people will be impacted, but everybody else on a busy highway won't be impacted. And even what those three people see will be slightly different. Even what gets captured on film is not the same as what they remember seeing, but there is something captured on film. Like these things are really perplexing in terms of what happens. Another experience I'll share is that, and this one was really impacting for me too, when I was in I was at the Monroe Institute for a private retreat I was invited to. So this was a combination of ex-government people like John Alexander, who had been, working on this topic for a long time in official circles, researchers in this field, people who had been involved with psi phenomena, but not so much UFOs, and some really prime contactees, experiencers that are well known, like Chris Bledsoe, for instance. And in addition to practicing different psi techniques during the day, we would actually also in the afternoon retire to our cubicles, have this out of body experience, kind of messaging coming through the walls, and you're relaxing in this completely blacked out room. But we were also building this shared collective field of intention for CE5 encounters that night. So then we would gather in this central meadow at the Monroe Institute at night. And on all three nights, we ended up seeing things in the sky, things that we were pretty positive were not prosaic. We had people who do this all the time there, and people would say that's a satellite, that's Starlink. Like we actually also had these coordinates we could look up in terms of, where's the International Space Station, where's Starlink, these different things. So we could eliminate what was just prosaic. And we definitely saw things that were anomalous in terms of how they were behaving. And we filmed the whole thing entirely as well. We had people who come down from Canada with really high quality film equipment. And then we actually submitted that to MUFON, and they also, after their investigation, concluded that it was anomalous, that they couldn't identify it as anything prosaic. But what was so interesting to me, more impacting really, is that soon after I began to get these telepathic downloads that really have together shaped basically my entire course, my entire direction since then in terms of what I focused on, what I feel called to do. I had already had some notions like that prior to then, and I'd had some strange experiences with meditation. For instance, around 2010, I had a kind of an interesting experience with that, but this seemed to kick it into a higher gear, and it really made this kind of an obsession for me. And it has directed my actions ever since then. And on top of that, as so many people who have these experiences know, it ties them with synchronicity that comes in, where it's not just one or two things, but it feels like this overarching, like synchronistic orchestration. So then you end up looking back at your entire life and feeling like, wait a second, I can see why these different things came together and how they did. And it's almost like, I remember hearing one time someone said this phrase that we live life moving forward, but we make sense of it looking back. Mm-hmm. And that's been very much my experience. So those are some of the encounters I've had that have really shaped not only how I see this, but how I've also lived my life since then.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing all that. Yeah. I have to say, I have a few questions that are bubbling up. And I also want to reflect, like, from my experience and the stories that I've heard, if someone has a being walk through the wall, I don't think I've ever heard of someone getting out of bed and walking towards it. I don't know if I've ever heard of that reaction. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And I think at that moment I was still separating my mind. Was this our daughter? As I got out of the bed. Uh-huh. And by the way, another piece of that is when I came back to bed, I didn't see this because I was now facing towards the bed. But my ex-wife saw the being come back through the wall and then walk down the front hall in front of the two beds and walk through the front door. So she actually saw it twice, which was really interesting. Yeah.
Wow. And so you were talking about early on, people having experiences and they felt dreamlike, or they were trying to keep them in my worldview. It's a continuum. Like there are definitely experiences that happen in the dream state. There are experiences that happen that are dreamlike, all of that. So I'm curious if that being seemed less substantial than a flesh and blood. Like, was it ghost-like? Was it sort of like an apparition? just if you would be interested in describing her a little bit more. I've had beings walk through the wall, so I'm also very curious.
Right. Yeah, sure. One of the things that's so interesting, this relates to what I was saying about people seeing kind of custom crafted visions of these things, is that when my ex-wife and I compared notes afterwards, we both saw very similar things, but there were some subtle differences in what we saw too. So, for instance, we both saw long blonde hair, but she saw the hair blowing as if there was like a source of wind in the room, which there wasn't, of course. But I didn't see that. So, other than that, she looked humanoid. There was kind of this uh, I wouldn't say it was transparent, but there was something weird about like the outline. There was something strange about it. But I also remember, because I was kind of in that weird state, like I do think, to your point about hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, it may have been the case that we were able to perceive it more than we might normally have because we had just woken up. And so there's kind of that in between, that liminal zone. I've often wondered about that. Would we have perceived her if it was the broad daylight of, of like 3 p.m. the next day or something? I don't know. But yeah, so it was interesting how I remember certain things. And then in comparing notes, there were subtle differences too. So, um, yeah, like she looked definitely older than my daughter, but not fully adult either, like probably adolescent. Um, and like I say, the other thing I really remember noticing was the facial expression. And what's strange about that too is that it kind of, I remember like being really drawn into that facial expression because of that look of surprise and almost shock. Um, Yeah. So, and then of course, what's interesting is when you reflect on it over and over and over again, you begin to wonder, how much am I remembering directly? How much is this based on the conversation my ex-wife and I have had about the experience? It's a very strange thing. And also, what occurs to me that makes me so thankful that we did have that conversation and I did stay awake is that if I had gone back to sleep, I probably either would have dismissed it as a dream or, forgotten it entirely. And I wonder how many people are having those experiences and just not remembering, or just, saying it's a dream in their minds. So I think about that as well.
Yeah. 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 The fact that it was a shared experience is huge. Every time I've had a shared experience, there's something very comforting about it, because it does plant it in reality in a different way. Yeah. I had a question that we'll see if it comes back. It has floated away. But I do have other questions. One of them being, you mentioned doing kind of shamanic journeying and having that experience. Did you grow up with a sense of being connected to spirituality or the paranormal, other than just being super fascinated by ufology? Like, what was that like? Has it been a lifelong thing for you?
It's such an interesting question. And I swear that changes a little bit over time as I look back on it. Because again, sometimes I have memory fragments that come back that hadn't remembered before. I would say that the way I would describe myself is when I came into the world, I remember being kind of in shock at how emotionally dangerous this world felt. And, I had a really good family, a fairly typical happy childhood. There were some challenges between my brother and I, but generally speaking, it was a normal childhood. But I just remember not realizing this at the time, but in retrospect, I realized I was particularly impacted by the way that people could hurt each other, like emotionally, with their words and the way they misunderstood each other. And I remember feeling like that was not what I was used to. I'm not sure what I was basing what I was used to on, but in retrospect, I feel like I have some memory of this kind of seamless realm where there's telepathic communication, where nothing is hidden, where there's these sort of like misunderstandings that lead to distortion and anger didn't exist. So I remember thinking early on, I'm going to have to stiff arm the world, like just to get through, And I remember sort of taking that perspective really early on, that I'm going to um, create a buffer between me and other people. And I didn't even talk to my parents about this. I remember my mom saying I was unusual, unlike other kids, and that I didn't seem to ever want hugs or need hugs. I have often felt like I observe and watch humanity, but I don't fully identify with it, which is not how I would have described it when I was young, of course. You don't go around saying that. But in retrospect, that's how I feel sometimes. So sometimes I feel like an observer here to watch the entire thing and have enough background to feel like I can operate here, but it does feel quite foreign to me sometimes. So not just the way human society runs, but even the way humans interact with each other. I think that has really impacted me more recently as I reflect on those experiences, some of the anomalous experiences, when I think about the fact that that being was in the hotel room when my wife was pregnant with our son. I know about the multi-generational way that this sometimes impacts families. Makes me wonder. I know that my dad has also had experiences, so it seems to come from that side of the family. But he grew up in the UK. He was born in World War II. People don't talk about those things at all. People didn't even talk about the trauma they went through in World War II, let alone, anomalous experiences. But he's had many of those, including, having experiences with deceased relatives that have come back, those kinds of things. So, yeah, I think about all of that in terms of how I've framed reality. And I would say that more recently, another thing that changed was at some point I came to the point where I realized, okay, this stiff arm approach to the world is effective in terms of, preventing me from being bludgeoned by, emotional trauma. But I also realized I was missing out on being really close to people and the connection that can come from that. So I realized I wanted to adjust my way of interacting with the world and with people. And that seemed to create a new level of awareness for me, where suddenly so much more stimuli was coming in, picking up stuff from people that hadn't been that way before. And I would say that's another thing that's happened since even the encounter I had at the Monroe Institute, and what changed afterwards is sort of this just sort of psychic awareness. It seems to be like I think all of us have much more of that capacity than we realize. Some of it comes down to practicing, and I've really diligently practiced with people close with me over the last couple of years. But also something seems to have upticked that way as well. So yeah, it's a long story, but I do think even as a really young kid that I remember feeling different. I remember feeling like even though I had, compared to some people, a very loving and supportive home, but still for me, human civilization, even at its best, felt very, very strange. I remember that feeling.
Yeah, and I just resonate with that so deeply. I grew up in, what could be considered an idyllic landscape, a very small family, very connected to nature, animals, um, no real religious like overculture imposed on me. I really got to explore, extremely sensitive to the world, and felt like it was a very dangerous place. And I really didn't quite understand the rules of what to do here and how to operate. And my response to that was to two things. One is to just come kind of half out of body. Honestly, like I just dissociated a little bit and spent most of my life like that. And also, my internal world became very, very rich and very difficult to explain to people. And I never tried or rarely did. But yeah, a response to sort of the intensity of the world and what I call dumb suffering. The stuff like there's plenty of
Mhm.
natural suffering that happens with death and decay and pain and all the stuff that just comes with being embodied on a planet. But then there's all this dumb suffering that we do to each other that is completely
Right.
unnecessary. That, like you said, the emotional pain. And it's interesting as well because part of my journey over the last few years has been turning like um, expanding the capacity of the emotional body, which sounds similar to what you're talking about, and
Mhm.
how that opened this world that was much richer. The more, I just like learned to feel my feelings basically. And
Yeah.
as a very conscious response to deciding, like, okay, maybe this story is true. Maybe I'm from somewhere else. Maybe I don't really know how to human, but I really love this planet. And I'm really actually
Right.
kind of in love with humanity, even though it's so messy and crazy. It's also really beautiful. So I'm gonna choose to come here. I'm like planting. I don't want to, some sort of less colonialized way than planting a flag, but like
Right,
I'm going to
right,
be here, right? Like this is what
right.
I'm in devotion to, is this planet. And so how do I figure this out? And the biggest piece was um expanding the capacity of the emotional body, which has been a journey into grief that's now like coming full circle into joy, and a very rich experience. So cool that you had that, that was something that you opened up to as well.
Yeah, and there's a few more things I can share about that. One is that I also relate to what you're saying about this rich inner world, and I very much, yes, did retreat from the world to some degree, but my inner world was very rich as well, to the point where even when my own kids were growing up, I think I underestimated the degree to which they weren't like that.
Mm.
So I remember being so independent as a teenager and into my 20s. And even before then, right? Like I said, like my mom remembers noting that I did not act like a normal kid, very different than my brother, for instance. And so for me, I was so independent, so able to sort of create this equilibrium inside myself, that I was able to remove myself and still maintain this equilibrium and feel very happy. There wasn't much I needed to be happy. And it was when my kids, were teenagers, that I began to realize, oh, not everybody's wired this way. And that was
Mhm.
strange to me because I remember so clearly what I was like as a teenager. So that's been interesting. And to your point about, the emotional body, yeah, absolutely. And of course, when I made that arrangement when I was really, really young, saying this is dangerous, that cuts off so much information, right? So it prevents the bludgeoning that you might otherwise be subject to, but also eliminates huge amounts of information. So I was a bit struck by how overwhelming that information was when I first reoriented myself with the world and said, I'm going to be here fully emotionally and let people in. Um, and what I also say to even people in some of the classes I teach is that that's just information, right? Rather than seeing it as either negative or positive or in between, just see it as information. When you bang your knee and it hurts, rather than shaking your hand at God, you could just say, it's my body trying to say, don't do that again. It's not good
Mm.
for you, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So trying to be open to the information, trying not to retract away from what feels negative or painful or scary, trying to really greet that and even see how it can morph and change as you work with the energy. Like it doesn't have to stay the way it is. And also having this sense that in this human experience, so much of what ends up being encoded and sort of even passed up the line, I would say, is in emotion. Like so
Mm.
much of the richness of experience is encoded in emotion. So when we think about really impacting emotional events, people talk about time slows down and you remember every single detail, like incredibly rich canvas, right, of these kinds of experiences. And on top of that, I think most of us begin to realize that what makes people deep and compassionate and able to really understand the experience of others is difficulty. So that has changed how I think about these things too, that the things that I look back at as the most difficult I've been through have also been the most shaping for me and have engendered this compassion I have towards others and a way to relate to them. So even though it does feel slightly awkward and not my default setting to human, I've embraced it, and I think it allows me to now sort of go through the world in a way that I can take in all that information, not retract away from it, not disassociate, but also have this larger context in mind, which makes me not get totally baked into this is all there is and whatever happens here, that's the end. Like I don't see it that way at all. So it allows me this ability to be here, keep my experience apparatus open, right? Not retract away, not close down, um, and learn so much because of that. Like there's so much that can be transformed, and so many of these things that come in as one kind of input can be transmuted into something else. And I even feel that's part of my role here is to learn to do that and to help other people do that. But the fact that I'm so clear about this not being the only context there is, and this is only one subset of a much larger reality set, changes, I think, how I embrace everything. And even when we think about so many of the overwhelming elements in the world right now, and people really being concerned that there's three or four different extinction level kind of matters working all at the same time. And for some people, that's incredibly daunting, overwhelming, and people either shut down or disassociate. For me, I try to stay alive in it, awake in it, because I do have this sense that maybe deep down, and I say maybe in a kind of coy way, because I do believe deep down that I signed up for this to some degree, that this is part of a design. And if you're going to experience something that is not ultimate, that your life doesn't end when this body dissolves, then why not come in at a time where this apex experience is happening for the civilization, because that has so much potential in terms of soul development and that kind of thing, and even how source can learn from these kinds of experiences. So I try to stay open and fully embrace and experience everything that's happening. That feels very rich, even if it can sometimes be overwhelming too.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There's so much in there. A slightly different lens than the way that I've ultimately contextualized things, but like so much overlap. The biggest thing that I learned from grief was that it is that it contains alchemy. That if you don't, I call it like touching bottom. Part of what I'm doing here is to feel as deeply as possible. Even my like astrology and human design stuff, it's all emotional. It's all the emotional body. And it felt very overwhelming for a long time. So I shut it all down. So when I did open back up to feel my feelings, it is a lot. I go down,
Right.
down, down. And then I find that there is a turn. There is a point where something alchemizes and it is alive. It does become something different. And it's very different than being overwhelmed by an emotion and not having a higher perspective or the understanding that this, that kind of witness self that can understand, like, I'm choosing to go down. I'm choosing to feel all of these things deeply and also go up, which is my newest thing. It's like, oh, joy. Okay. So I'm going to figure that out, but having capacity for like great joy and bliss it's intense, it's really big, but I'm doing it on purpose because of this human experience. So I really resonate with that. And yeah, understanding that that death isn't the end, which of course my human body, is like, yeah, it is for this body, death is terrifying. And also it is a natural process that happens on this planet. And so having that higher understanding and realizing, yeah, if we did choose to come here during this time, then it can be a wild adventure instead of, pushing it away or keeping things at a distance or just trying to stay safe from it. But of course, that's been a lifelong journey, which gives, like you said, compassion for people who can't fathom looking at this as an adventure, which I completely understand. There's a lot of compassion for that because it's not an easy ride. And if before that perspective comes, it feels very unsafe and it can feel really dangerous to people and the suffering. Like for me, it's like, of course, compassion needs to be here because suffering is real along with these higher perspectives.
Yeah, I think that sweet spot between staying in it, being aware of it, not trying to dismiss or ignore things that are happening that are pretty dark and difficult, but also not disassociating from it to the point where we're kind of just going, I'm a multidimensional being, man. I'm not even going to pay attention to that. Like, I don't think that's helpful either. We do need to be in it. I think one thing I try myself, and I also suggest this to others sometimes when they ask me about this, relates to what you were talking about, how this body, will die, and this body has a reaction to that. So our body kind of has its own kind of intelligence and its own kind of awareness in a way, and it's kind of based on a few basic factors. Propagate the species, eat, sleep, and survive. Right, those kind of things. So what that means is sometimes there can be like meditative practices around like practicing death, is what I call it, where you basically imagine a scenario where maybe because of society getting crazy or something, you die sooner than you would from a natural death, perhaps, and actually practicing how you will make that transition. Partly because in the moment, your body's going to flare up and say, we must survive no matter what, right? And that can dominate your mentality, your consciousness at the time. So what I really try to do, being aware there's this sort of different components of us, is try to be aware of and give voice to the one that wants to sort of be the executive in the situation, who's going to sit on the throne is the way that I put it, so that I'm better prepared when that does happen, if it does happen. Like when I think about research I've seen done around, for instance, athletes that are preparing for some sort of event, they've done these experiments where they will have, say, a third of the athletes that are about to compete in a competition do a combination of, or they do just physical preparation, basically, right? So imagine they're going to do a ski run the next day. So they just keep skiing and skiing the run. And then another third of the group does half mental preparation, like imagining coming down the run, how am I going to react? And then the other half being physical, actual skiing. And the third group does only mental preparation and no actual skiing the day before. And it's actually the third group that has the best results, which is very interesting. So I think about that in terms of trying to prepare for events that might arise. I also say to people, and try to reflect on this myself, that be careful what you wish for, because we are kind of taught in our society, which is a low risk kind of society, risk averse kind of society, that the ideal is to get through life feeling good, doing good things, having positive experiences, feeling relaxed. But if this is a stage set for the evolution of consciousness, which is how I ultimately perceive it, then you're not getting much for your money if that's what you sign up for, right? Because then you leave without really having learned any of these deep soul lessons, and then you just sort of keep repeating until you do. So for me, when intense things are arising, I'm aware that while my body might not like that feeling, my higher self knows this is exactly the kind of learning I need, the actual like energetic, like I'm in the mix with the energy, right? So as we can think about these things, we're a very cerebral society, but it's only when we're in it, feeling the energy arise, that we have the chance to move the energy, right? I use this analogy sometimes of like judo or karate, where you're basically receiving this movement and you're like pushing it, you're moving it through. You're not resisting it, you're reacting, you're responding and moving it through you, kind of thing. So but you can only practice that when the energy is intense, when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling sad, when you're feeling scared. So I'm aware of those things, knowing that from my higher self perspective, it makes sense that I would sign up for those things, because those are the things that really make a quality life from that perspective. So it kind of flips everything around. So I do try to think about this. And lastly, I would say, for me, I really do have this kind of simultaneous feeling of being a person in a body, but I also have a feeling of something, like I identify with something beyond the body. So it makes it easier for me to see this as one expression of a larger I, that, where I locate that depends on the perspective I'm taking at the moment.
Yeah. Amazing. I love all of that so much. Do you have I'm thinking about death practice, which is something I talk about a lot as well. And it's in a lot of spiritual lineages and mystical traditions. Do you have like a spiritual tradition that you follow, or is your perspective just arisen because of your experiences?
Well, I would say it's a bit of a smorgasbord. So I was raised in a pretty like a laissez-faire kind of household, no particular religious affiliation. In fact, it was when I was a teenager, like my latter teens, that I sort of pursued Christianity, because at that moment I was transitioning into being a young adult, and I kind of wanted some hard answers and some absolutes to steer my life by. So I went through that and went through numerous different expressions of Christianity, moving more and more towards sort of mystical expressions, and also had some experiences in that were pretty charismatic, and was also drawn to those kinds of circles. So some of my experiences, even some of the accounts within the UFO phenomenon, don't sound so completely unlike some of the experiences I'm aware of that I had in some of these other traditions. And then that sort of more mystical aspect of Christianity eventually took me to Thomas Merton's work, and from then kind of bridged into Buddhism and Eastern cosmologies. And so from since then, I kind of went from mostly orienting around a kind of Christian mystical kind of perspective to more of a Buddhist and Vedantic kind of perspective. And that also feels like one of those synchronistic orchestrations, because when I began to get this sort of communication around how things are set up and what this life is within this larger context, so much of that fit together. Like some of it filled in and it was more color available, but it fit with the basic principles I already had sort of been leaning towards because of those traditions. So in my Buddhist practice, a lot of meditation, which helped me drop into this space where I'm aware of a much broader, expansive reality where I don't really identify with this body mind at all. That has been really useful to make me really present to the fact that this is not all there is, because I, again, have the experience of not being in this body. And yeah, so I would say that that kind of has been my background. I also definitely got into kind of shamanic rituals and understandings of things. And I, again, really liked the experiential aspect of that, how it's not about sitting and listening to someone talk about a bunch of ideas. It's very much a practice that you get into. And it puts you in contact with non-ordinary states of reality. So all of this kind of fits together. And so when I then really embraced this research and investigation into the phenomenon, that, as we call it colloquially, so much of that fit together. So these different pieces that you then find that some people find very discombobulating, like, nuts and bolts make sense to me, but what about these experiences people are having? And is it happening in reality or not? Like even the, nebulous nature of what is real, and there being different sort of aspects to that, different dimensional kind of ways that we can interact with these things. That was already part of my background, both experientially and in terms of how I made sense of the world. So it has been, I think, a less of a steep climb for me than it is for some people who come from a sort of scientific, physicalist kind of perspective, thinking these are straight technological craft from Alpha Centauri, and then being, encountering all of the other high strangeness associated with this.
Mm-hmm. A lot of resonance there for me as well, just in terms of finding a worldview that where everything fits. Everything is allowed. I study Vajrayana Buddhism, and it's like and also I view the world through like an animist lens, that there are no dead things, everything is alive, and it all fits and it all makes sense, and it has room for my very wild experiences, and that worldview is really, really helpful for that. Yeah, I agree. And even though, again, a lifetime of experiences, but our, what I call the overculture, is so rational materialist oriented that it's only what you can measure, and then everything else was pushed away as unreal, that even somebody who's had a lifetime of experiences, it was a journey to come back to or to allow in the idea that that's actually not how the world, that's not really what reality is. And I know that there's a lot of people that are, I think our culture is actually, it might not be, mainstream quite yet, but it feels like we're quite close to being like, oh, it's not, actually it's just not empirically true that this is a rational materialist world. Mm-hmm. And that reality doesn't work that way. And you have to account for consciousness. And I listened to a talk with Jeffrey Mishlove about with a remote viewer who talked to like 1,000 or 1,500 remote viewers and asked them what the future was like, and then correlated all the commonalities. And one of the things that they said was that like the foundational way that we look at reality will change, and it's not too far in the future, just because of understanding that it's a both and, that it's a mix. We do live in a material world, and also,
Right. Yeah, I mean, for me, one thing I haven't mentioned yet that was really helpful for me in making that transition was a long stint in studying integral theory, and I was also involved in these integral salons when I was in California, in the Sacramento area. Was a leader in one of those salons, and that really helped me because Ken Wilber's work was one of the pioneering stints in expressing how reality is multidimensional, that we cannot reduce things just to the surface layer, the things we can only measure, and then assume everything else is subjective mush that doesn't count. So he kind of developed this 4-quadrant model where you have an I that is external, but you also have this rich internal world, and that's real. You can't collapse those. You can't say all that counts is what's physically measurable. And the same thing with the collective. We both have an external expression and we have this deep subconscious that kind of Jung talked about. So that really helped me to already be aware of these different kinds of modalities of truth in the world, and that you can't collapse one into the other, nor can you say, here's a map by which I measure these things, and anything I can't map isn't real. He really helped me understand and give voice to the fact that these different truth traditions that exist around the world have been used because they've been helpful. They do map to something useful, otherwise they would not have been used. I often point out that shamans historically, were sought out by the tribe or whatever, not just because they had cool, fun things to say that sounded mystical, but because the information they picked up when they, actually journeyed into these worlds gave them actionable information about where they should go to find food, or where crops will grow, or where the weather will be better, things like that. That these are actionable kinds of information they come back with. So for me, when I came into the UFO phenomenon, again, I feel privileged in that I'd already made that journey into trying to see how all these work together. And I totally agree with you that the evidence is already there, that reality is much more expansive than we are accounting for under reductionistic materialism. And again, kind of not humaning so well. It's strange to me how all that evidence can be staring us in the face, and yet we're basically just ignoring it or turning away. Just like the mainstream still doesn't really embrace the UFO phenomenon, even though the data is pretty obviously extensive at this point. That's also true of psi phenomena, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. Like, all of these are connected and all pointing in the same kind of direction. And we can only ignore that for so long. And I remember even when I was reading up on and hearing from people who were working with John Mack back in the 90s, he actually sought out Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book about the structure of scientific revolutions, pointing out that we do have these massive shifts that happen. It's not just this incremental growing and an additive process in one direction. You have moments where so much new data comes in that you have this revolutionary science that no longer can even really talk with the other kind of science because it's so different. And that's definitely where we are now, recognizing that there are some people that are not convinced, not because they think the data is lacking, but they just don't want to believe it. It doesn't fit with the way they see the world. Science as it is practiced is far less objective than it claims to be. But I agree with you. Eventually, when we get there, just because it becomes so overwhelming. And I remember I gave this one talk at the Anomalous conference in New York, and I quoted Schopenhauer at the end, where he basically says something, paraphrasing here, like, at first, these new truths will be mocked and scoffed at. Then they will be violently opposed as self-evident, right? So this is kind of the process we go through. First, people just think it's so funny and they don't feel any threat from it, so they just laugh at it and mock it, kind of what ufology was like, 20 years ago. Then they get to a point where it's getting so much traction that they violently opposed it because it goes against their worldview. And then finally, you have a new generation that goes, "This is just the way things are," and haven't we almost known this kind of thing? So, yeah.
It brings up a question that, like I said, one thing that's really alive for me right now is the idea of influence. And I don't know about you, but my part of my story is that I went deep into like what I call like Facebook religion of the, late 90s, early 2000s, where there was a lot of like channeling, a lot of new age stuff, a lot of things that there was a lot of truth mixed into that. It felt very exciting and alive, but it was also often a really kind of watered down version of some of these deeper lineages, and it didn't have the complexity. It didn't have space for it. Fine. But part of that was this big conspiracy theory thing. I remember like being in a bar when I was, I don't know how old, I probably was like 22, and someone whispering to me that 9/11 was an inside job, like that kind of stuff. And this idea that we're being controlled. And so I have kind of an allergy to that. And because I went down those rabbit holes and I found them unhelpful at some point to give all of my power away to this invisible external authority that may, or, it just was not helpful after a time. And also was trying to collapse the narrative too much. It didn't have room for the nuance and all of that. But it's just been coming up for me. I've been revisiting some of those ideas. I just read Penetration by Ingo Swann, which before a few years ago, I didn't know ufology existed. I didn't read, I read Whitley's book 4 years ago. I haven't even read, I have like a stack of books and I just haven't been through it. I don't have the whole picture of all of this. So when I come across these things, it really made me think about, it doesn't even have to be nefarious necessarily, but just that there are kind of control mechanisms in place to keep culture and society focused in a certain direction. And there may be parts of it that are nefarious, that we don't really want to. I guess my internal realization is that we are like wildly powerful, humans are, and have all of these capacities. And I'm personally just rediscovering them, and other people, that seems like there's this emerging culture of people rediscovering their capacities, and that it may not be in the best interest. I think Joshua Cutchin put it really clearly. He's like, if we all realize that death is actually safe, it's pretty hard to control to control people. And so I feel like I'm treading lightly here because I don't, again, want to go down like the dark conspiracy rabbit hole, but also acknowledging there's some of this. So I'm curious if your thoughts on that, because I think that you've looked into these things more than I have.
Yeah, it is the rabbit hole of rabbit holes. And I think one thing I've made note of is that probably the biggest reality shift, paradigm shift for me is not that these other beings exist and surround us and are in our midst, even when we don't perceive them, but actually some of the conspiracy theory kind of level stuff around control systems in society that have involved both nefarious human groups and sometimes some non-human groups. I have seen enough data now that I'm convinced some of that is absolutely true. Um, I think that on the one hand, I'm careful about how I communicate that to people because some people kind of become so alarmed by that they kind of collapse into inaction and then they feel overwhelmed. And I agree with your other point completely that we are incredibly powerful beings. And even when we think about our origins as a species and whether or not we were engineered, again, that's the human body mind, right? That's the part of us that's here in this iteration, but we're much more than that. We have these multidimensional aspects to us. So even if our origins are tied to that kind of engineering, our ultimate nature is source consciousness. And like you say, everything's alive and connected and seamless in many ways. And even when you think about the implications of some of these quantum experiments, which, speaking of scientific revolutions, are not fully taken seriously yet. There's still scientists trying to find ways to invalidate those findings or say they were misinterpreted, but they make a pretty clear case that the consciousness connection is key, that how we interact with the world to some degree creates the world that collapses into being around us. So in that sense, if we get too far down a fear state, then that's the kind of world that we're going to manifest, right? I also don't think that means we can just picture nice palaces and white stallions with, unicorn horns and things and rainbows, and that's all we get. Like, obviously not. Nor do we really want that, to my earlier point about we really want the depth of the experience because of how we grow. But yes, absolutely. When I think back to what disclosure potentially entails, it's so much more than, hey, yeah, turns out there are alien beings here with craft and whatnot. So much more than that. It goes back to human origins, goes to our future. It goes to accords that have been made. I think it's so fascinating that we now have as part of the historical record that Dave Grush in front of Congress testified to there being these accords between non-human intelligence and elements of the military industrial complex. Like, that's a huge thing to have as part of the congressional record, like a turning point in human civilization. And I make the point to people that even though I've had encounters with much more benevolent beings who I think are closer to source consciousness, so they're non-dual and transpersonal in how they relate to myself and everyone else, because that's what naturally happens when that's your perspective, that the beings who've made accords with elements of the military industrial complex are not going to be those beings. I try to point that out to people. So I do think there have been even generations and generations and generations of these abusive cycles in certain families that are part of control structures, and they've found ways to, in a pretty sophisticated way, fracture and disassociate human psyches to their benefit. I think that is ongoing and somehow tied to the military. There's so many people who have memories of those kinds of experiences that have, connections to the military and their families. I think all that's true. And I think that part of the reason why elements of the military industrial complex are so resistant to the idea of acknowledging that these other beings exist and have interacted with us is because all of these other things open up as well. How do you open up Pandora's box with the whole thing spilling out? And some of it is pretty nefarious and pretty dark. But at the same time, again, to your earlier point, I totally agree that we are incredibly powerful beings, that when we let that fear state dominate, that reduces our ability to see and to respond. So it's important to have this more overarching perspective of who we are in place, even while we choose not to turn away from or deny some of these other elements that are in the mix as well.
That's all really well said. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm realizing for me lately as well that it's because fear was my background frequency for a really long time, and that has really shifted, and my life has shifted in relation to that. And I'm also seeing this because we do interact with reality, and I do believe that where, this is one thing the beings told me, like where we place our attention and the quality of our attention changes our reality. And they told me that, and it's playing out through time, and I'm understanding more and more what that means. So because of that, I focus less on, again, the idea that I don't dismiss the idea that there is a conscious effort to kind of control and direct for people's own benefit or for other beings' own benefit as well. I don't dismiss that at all. And also, I tend to look more at my own personal responsibility and how can I interact with the world differently. And so one of those things is just the existence of screens, of our phones that are so easy to become addicted to. And lately for me, that has really arisen, like, wow, our attention, our awareness is powerful and valuable. And if it's a currency, then this phone has done a really great job of figuring out how to capture as much of that as possible. And so understanding even that level of influence, what am I looking at all day? What am I doing with my physical body? How much of my energy and attention is going into a screen? I just spent some time away from my phone. I literally didn't turn it on or look at a screen for like a week, which was amazing. I don't know how long it's like been since, before the internet existed, probably that I had that experience. And I have to say that the world became really alive really fast. And I'm someone who believes in and interacts with an animate world, but everything shifted really dramatically. And it gave me an understanding that that for me, it seems like I've been interacting with like simulacrums for a while, and it's not real. This is real, and it gives us the opportunity to do this, and it's amazing. And also, if I'm kind of passively feeding my attention to something that will continue to eat it forever, there's no, it's sort of neutral. Like it will just continue to take in that energy. It's kind of how egregores are created. Just having that awareness and deciding I want to do something different has been front and center lately. And also acknowledging that, whether it's corporate, whether it's governmental, whatever it is, that millions and millions and millions of dollars are spent trying to figure out how to capture our attention. And they're really good at it because it includes the emotional body as well. It includes our dopamine system. It includes the nervous system and all of that. So yeah, so it's fear and also sort of this passive dullness, like a dullness.
Placated, pliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've thought a lot about that, and I completely agree. And it's, again, one of the great ironies of modern life is that we're more technologically connected than ever. You're in a remote location in Colorado talking to me in a remote location in North Carolina. We couldn't have done that 20 years ago, right? But while we are more technologically connected, we're more disconnected both with each other across the planet and in terms of our deep awareness of ourselves. And how many people just don't get to experience the natural world, either because they have busy lives or it doesn't occur to them.
Mhm.
Some people have lived in concrete jungles for so long they don't know what it's like to be walking in a forest. And I absolutely believe there's been a lot of work done around how do you keep a large populace satiated? How do you make them happy enough that they think they are getting what they want, while really you are shutting down these deeper, more powerful aspects of them? Because you have to both make them believe that they have some sense of, self-control, some agency, some sovereignty, while also feeding them the very things that rob them of some of the more expansive aspects of that. Dopamine being a big one,
Mhm.
right? There's a friend of mine has done some really interesting research on levels of obesity tied to like fast food and those kinds of things, and how prior to a certain point in the 20th century, those rates were almost nil across the country. Then they just started skyrocketing, and then they had to keep creating new categories because they were becoming like so obese that it didn't even fit with the previous categories. And it was very much tied to what people eat. And we know that the these fast food joints that are everywhere, it's the cheapest food available. Some of the best food is the most expensive, hard to find. Of course, that creates that creates a kind of certain condition for a person where their body becomes like a trap, and it just becomes about these dopamine hits. And same thing with online pornography and how the dopamine hit with that. Like so many of these things that, again, give people the illusion that they're getting what they want, that they're choosing it, but you're giving them this smorgasbord of things that actually, like you say, it dulls their awareness, it dulls their capacities. And so if you pull that bait and switch, you create this populace that feels like they're choosing their lives, but in many ways, the options they're given all result in that kind of dumbed down kind of experience of being a human. And that serves their purposes, because it's only when we're asleep and focused on our screens and these different dopamine hits that we don't open our eyes and see what else is around in terms of what's going on, but also the amazing potential we have. So I think absolutely those things kind of go hand in hand.
Mhm. Yeah. It's not great. It's not great. And I always, part of what I think I'm doing here is everything gets run through my system. In order for me to understand things at a deep level, I go through the experience of it. I have a history of addiction. Like I know what
Mhm.
it's like to go through that process. I know what it's like to be addicted. I know how hard it is to get out of it. And, dopamine
Mhm.
is so interesting because in order to get like a really good dopamine hit, you have to effort. Like that's part of it is
Right.
you have to like accomplish something, which is much harder to do than just like getting the random enough likes on your Instagram post or whatever that give you just
Right.
enough of it to keep you going. So yeah, so one of the things that I'm very lucky to have is my parents were part of the generations that kind of left the cities and came to the middle of nowhere. It was the spark that happened in the 60s and 70s, kind of this counterculture revolutionary idea connected to the land. And they did it. They came out here, they built a house, they spent they live off grid, it's all solar. We cut firewood, we have a garden, that kind of thing. And also screens have completely infiltrated all of that, right? But what my goal and mission is to regenerate that spark with a more mature aspect and connected to the land because it's hard. I want to install a blueprint where we can remember what it's like to be actually connected to the world and humans. So thanks for having that conversation with me, and because it's what I'm like striving for right now is to disengage from the easy, fast dopamine hits.
Yeah, and it's something you have to be aware of because it's seductive, right? And it draws you in ways that seem not that daunting. And the next thing you know, it's created these addictive cycles, and they're everywhere, and they're so ubiquitous at this point that they're not even recognized as that. And people have the illusion that they're actually choosing these things. Yeah,
Yeah.
tricky.
Yeah. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or talk about while we have a few more minutes together?
Well, I've really appreciated the conversation. I've appreciated the directions it's gone. And it's great to see how some of the things you really value are very similar as the ones I do. And that even my last point would be even the UFO phenomenon can become kind of one of those addictive cycles, right? Where people are constantly, what's happening next? Is disclosure happening? And they also build up this expectation that when finally disclosure happens, they kind of have this subconscious belief that all the problems will go away, that maybe that means the beings will come in and solve our energy problems and fix that and, fix this and that. And so it becomes its own kind of distraction and its own kind of obsession. And even though I am very focused on this general subject matter, it's within this larger context of, a holistic kind of lifestyle. And I find it very interesting that the most ascendant of these beings that people have interacted with and the encounters I've had very much affirm the thing we're talking about and talk so much about our problems in the world mainly arise from our misunderstanding of who we are. That it's not about A versus B have different perspectives, but both A and B not recognizing who they fundamentally are and how they're fundamentally connected to each other, to the planet, to this larger biome. So the things we're talking about that we value are all about reminding us about those things so that it becomes an embodied kind of awareness, not just an idea. So I think that's important. And I hope that more people will take up that mantle and really develop a more holistic understanding and a somatic awareness and a way to be in the world. Because for me, that's been central. And when I think about sort of the messages I've received, it's as much about that as anything to do with the usual stuff we talk about. So, yeah, that's really important to me. Happy to see that people like you are called to similar things and actually living it where you are in Colorado.
Thank you so much. Yeah, those are all you said so many keywords in my life, the embodiment, the somatic experience of being alive. And I often say, like, how did we start with UFOs and get to feeling our feelings and the emotional body? But it's all, there's some sort of, as Stuart Davis says, like, it becomes a developmental driver, and turns out it's not necessarily about like ascending away from the body, from the earth. It's actually about deepening, going down and in. Who are we as humans? What are we capable of?
Right.
What can we do while we're here? And we're like, the potential is enormous and we've sort of forgotten. So yeah, love it. Thank you so much for your time and excellent conversation.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate it. And I hope we stay in touch.
Absolutely. Me too. Thank you so much to ExoAcademian Darren King. And thank you to Morgan Jenks for our musical soundscapes. If you'd like to support my work, please consider becoming a patron by visiting patreon.com/Robin Lassiter. Someday soon-ish, we're going to start having monthly get-togethers so that you can talk to me and talk to each other, and I think that'll be a lot of fun. If you'd like to book a one-on-one session with me or want more information about my work, please visit honeyheart.org.